Hi, welcome to this MennoNerds interview with Pastor Marty Troyer. He is the pastor of Houston Mennonite Church and the author of the new book, The Gospel Next Door. I am Katelin Hansen. I'm a blogger with the blog By Their Strange Fruit and the minister of music at Church for All People in Columbus, Ohio. Thank you, Pastor Marty, for joining me tonight. I'm glad to be in this conversation with you. I love the work that you're doing out there and looking forward to sharing that with our Hangouts audience tonight.
Yeah, Katelin, hi. I'm coming to you from Houston and really excited to talk with you tonight about the book, but also just to talk to you about what is going on here in Houston and in some ministries that I know. And I'm really hoping we'll hear some ministries about and some stories from Columbus too, because I know there's great stuff happening there. So good evening, everybody. Great to have you here with us.
Pastor Marty, maybe you could start us out just talking a little bit about the premise for your book and maybe some of what got you thinking along these lines that you wanted to share.
Yeah, okay, great question. So I think that for me the book was born probably 3 years ago when I was, I started off as a journal, but it ended up as kind of what I would call like a little mini worship service all by myself, and just realizing that there were a lot of good things that were happening in Houston in the church, and I'd kind of amassed these little stories along the way, but all of a sudden I started to see that there are these bigger connections going on, and that really was one of the biggest roots for me, where I was able to say, man, there's really something happening in Houston that's, I think, beyond the normal, and certainly beyond what I was seeing before that. So just, yeah, really wanting to tell stories from, ended up being from Houston, but also just stories about what I experienced God doing and inviting people through those stories to do their own thing in their own settings and figure out how they can see God and then join in wherever they're at. Big city, small city, and everything in between.
Absolutely. Something right off the bat I wanted to be sure that you talk to us about. In your book, you talk about borrowing the eyes of God, and I'm hoping you'll tell us a little bit more about what that means and how we do it.
Yeah. So that's one of the chapter titles, and I look at church history and I look at Christianity in general, and I think we're in a time right now where you can see this again, where there are a lot of people who we disagree on things. It's not clear what it means to be Christian, and as we interpret culture, as we interpret stories, everything from Orlando to politics to Brexit, that there's such a difference of opinion. And so this idea of borrowing the eyes of God is language that invites us to see the world through God's eyes and not just through our own political party or not just through our own denomination. And that's all great rhetoric, that's great words like borrowing the eyes of God, but for me, what that ultimately means is that you look at the world through the lens of Jesus, who is the gospel, and we don't understand Jesus unless we understand shalom, which is the Old Testament's biggest word, and then also justice. So these three kind of lenses come together, Jesus, shalom, and justice, and when we have those as a theological and as a practical behavioral foundation, then I think that's how we can borrow the eyes of God and see the world differently.
So what does shalom and justice look like for you in your neighborhood?
Yeah, I think that's a really fun question. I love to play with the idea that Jesus taught us to pray for God's will to come on earth as it is in heaven. And I happen to live in Houston, so I always talk about how Jesus asks us to pursue God's will in Houston as it is in heaven, which I think is a parallel. I think Scripture would say that shalom, the will of God, the kingdom of God, that those are all of the same God stuff. And so, yeah, so what does shalom look like in my city? One really interesting story that's happening right now is this really broad look at criminal justice. And I was just talking again today with one small story within this broader story of what shalom looks like, and was again just realizing that each of us has a role, but you can't build shalom one person or even one community or even one church at a time. You have to have this broader look. So yeah, in Houston, I think it's really important that we are pursuing shalom. We're seeing shalom at work through reform of the criminal justice system, for Christians who are leading and abolishing the death penalty, for Christians who are leading some really great post-prisoner care ministries, especially in downtown Houston. There are these amazing stories of public-private partnerships that are happening that 10 years ago people barely could dream about, and now they're reality on the ground. People are in the same room together talking about post-prisoner care and what it looks like to care for people who are dropped off a bus with nothing, and they have no place to go, no resources, no jobs, and the church is stepping in to fill that gap. So that's that's like one story in this broader look at what shalom is, but it happens 1,000 tiny decisions at a time, and that's one really great story that is helping me glimpse what shalom looks like in Houston.
Absolutely, that's great. So in your book, you also talk about the difference between being a peacemaker and a peacekeeper. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that nuance for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So peace. Well, I should say I grew up Mennonite, and so pacifism was the language that I grew up with and felt comfortable with. And really what that meant for me growing up was that I was able to say no to war. I was able to say no to violence, but most of that happened overseas. And I wasn't necessarily trained for personal one-on-one interactions or group interactions. And so I think my default, because I wasn't trained to be a peacemaker, was I just wanted to keep the peace. So if there was ever conflict in my relationships or in a group or class that I was in, I saw it as my job to keep the peace, which a lot of times just meant like you tamp down the conflict and the crisis. And maybe you sweep it under the rug, maybe you pretend it's not there, or you dismiss it too fast. And I think those are all symptoms of peacekeeping, which I separate out from peacemaking, which is the introduction of real peace into a relationship, a group, or any sort of setting. And that's a really active thing. Instead of sweeping something aside or pretending it's not there, it's actually building the kinds of community that function well and where human flourishing can naturally take place. And so I think peacemaking and peacekeeping, they both happen at a very personal level, but they also happen in City Hall. I think they happen in our relationship with the government. They happen in our neighborhoods, and as our churches move more deeply into the neighborhood, I think there's something really special there, but it's because we're making peace, and we've stopped just being okay with keeping the peace and avoiding the conflict. We're actually building something positive, and for me, again, that has to include justice, has to include very Jesus-centered kinds of ministries. But when we do that, I think we're making something beautiful. We're not just turning our backs on something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but more about that goal and that aspiration rather than simply what you're not doing or what you're avoiding.
Absolutely. Like. Yeah. Well, and some people, I read as the peace pastor for the Houston Chronicle, and
I should have mentioned that. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and which I've been doing for a long time, and I've had people say to me that, and everybody uses different language, but I've had people say, well, peace isn't the solution, or peace isn't the way, or peace means passive, peace means pacifism, which means this very pacifist approach. And again, peacekeeping, I think a lot of people think of pacifism as peacekeeping, and I've pushed back on that sometimes the loudest people in the room, perhaps even sometimes the most angry people in the room, are the peacemakers, because they're the ones who have to call out what's wrong, call out the world as it is, and then take the really practical, necessary, positive steps to change that. But a lot of times change only can happen with this kind of divine discontent, where we're able to say, that's just not right, something's wrong here, and we're going to change this. So yeah, for me, peacemaking, again, it can be this sometimes radical, but a lot of times it's just very practical kinds of things. And it can mean turning up the volume, turning up the intensity, turning up the conflict at times instead of walking away from it. I do that quite often in Houston, and I see others too, and a lot of time that's really where the movement can happen.
Mm. Yeah, I guess sometimes I feel like the term peace is used as a tool of silencing, that people say, there's a call for peace, but really what they mean is quiet.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's a different understanding of peace than maybe what you're getting at.
I think it is. Yeah, and I would like to parse those words, and that's where I try to introduce the idea of peacekeeping, which for me, again, is that more negative, passive, let's walk away from this. Let's pretend everything's okay, grab hands and sing Kumbaya. That would be peacekeeping. And peacemaking tends to not be any of those things. It tends to be radically honest. And again, exceptionally practical. Like, it's not just saying no, but it's got to be saying yes to something. And at its best, that yes is a very practical, this is what I'm willing to do, this is what my group's willing to do, and this is what we invite you to partner with us in. Very practical and not just walking away. But yeah, I've seen that in my kind of public ministry here over and over again. And it's changed the way I think about peace too. My experience, my stories here have changed how I use that language and how I think about peace.
Mm-hmm. Do you have some examples of churches being peacemakers in your community or elsewhere?
Yeah, lots of stories. But again, for me, peace, and I claim this in the book, and I think this is a really beautiful thing, but in the Old Testament, I think shalom is the biggest word, the biggest theological word. It's this huge, huge concept that in it you put in salvation, in it you put in God, in it you put right relationship with each other. So it's a really big word. So when we talk about peacemaking, to me that means a lot of different things. And a great way to think about that is making peace is pursuing the common good as the common good looks like to Jesus, God's kingdom, and Scripture. So anyway, that wasn't your question. I just realized that. I got all theological there. But yeah, so.
But it's a good answer to the question I didn't ask. So that's good.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. So examples though of how that's happening. I mean, my book is full of them. One that might catch you off guard would be a story about Bob and Kathy Baldwin, who their story's been going on for a number of years, but several years ago, living in their neighborhood in the suburbs of Houston, there was conflict between their side of the neighborhood and a mobile home park on the other side of the road. And Bob and his family were part of upper middle class group, and the rhetoric and the thoughts from that side of the street is that it's probably time for the mobile home park to just go away. This is a problem, and let's solve this problem. So there was this tension between these two groups, and at some point, Bob and Kathy, they woke up and realized those are people on the other side, and they have this really beautiful story of like the second conversion where they looked across the street and they said, well, instead of having conflict with these people and we try to push them out, what if we as a family, what if we actually took ownership and responsibility for the mobile home park, and instead of pushing them out, turned it into a place where those families can thrive and people experience dignity. And through purchasing that mobile home park and raising the level of resources, they just completely drained the conflict out of that neighborhood. And very unexpected. And I love that story because to me that is a great story of peacemaking. Bob and Kathy are peacemakers, but not in this kind of radical standing on the street with a protest sign kind of a way. They did it with the skills they have, and they did it in this, they borrowed the eyes of God. They saw the other side of the street with very different eyes than their neighbors had and they had before. And I love that story because you now have this neighborhood where people get along, where there's this understanding. At a very basic level, there's an awareness that people on both sides of the street are Christian, that they go to the same churches even. So Bob and Kathy's story is really great, and I like to tell that story because it's a bit of a surprise, maybe especially for Mennonites who think of peacemaking as somehow more radical than that, which it also is, and I think it's both, which is it's why I love peace. It's just really holistic.
And maybe there's another example that you give in the book around your church's decision with Halloween candy. If you could tell us that story and tell us what was so ironic about some of the previous practices that your church had.
Yeah. So in the last couple of years, we've I guess it was just last year actually, and it started in our church for a while now, where we've looked at chocolate, which we all love, and I've got some over here on my counter right now too, and just becoming aware of where chocolate comes from and the kinds of labor that it requires to produce chocolate. And once you become aware of something, you can't unlearn the kinds of things that you learn about chocolate and coffee. And so we made a very intentional choice that we were going to buy really expensive, fair trade, non-slave chocolate. And I talk about that in the book. The irony that you're referring to there is that I've been to a couple of different conferences and different Christian gatherings where groups that are against human trafficking and are working on modern-day slavery will have chocolate on their table, like a little bowl. You can come up and take a card, take information, here's a piece of chocolate. And it's chocolate that's requires slave labor. It's not fair trade. It comes from companies that are not ethically sourcing their chocolate. And that's a huge, it's not an irony, that's cognitive dissonance there, that you are on one hand working to dismantle horrific systems of violence and modern day slavery, and yet you're buying chocolate that's actually making that so in another part of the world. So that was one of our awarenesses. Like, you can't unlearn that. You find that as maybe information, and then you just realize, hey, something's got to change here. So yeah, Halloween chocolate, and then Christmas chocolate, and then Easter chocolate now. And we have a fair trade store at church, and our point person on that, her name's Katelin. And oh, by the way, Katelin is the one who titled the book. She's brilliant. She's brilliant, and she's so brilliant that she orders chocolate for our whole church, and folks can then buy it from our fair trade store. So again, yeah, for me that's a very simple act of peacemaking, and that most of us wouldn't think of.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I like it.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of quotes from the book that I want you to expound on a little bit, and maybe the first one I'll read to you kind of comes towards the end a little bit, where you say, justice work is as much about spirituality and belief as it is about morality and action. It's the natural lifestyle of those who have experienced freedom from inner chains and have given themselves to breaking the outer chains that oppress. So if you could just talk about a little bit of what that means to you, both for your own life and then for your community itself.
Yeah, the blending of spirituality and behavior is, from my experience and my reading of history, that is the very core genius of Anabaptism. It's present in other streams. It's present in a lot of other denominations and in histories, but Anabaptism from our beginning has said there is a spiritual inner reality, and that like dances and works with our outer behavior and our outer actions. And so justice, which to me is very it's pretty practical. I mean, once you kind of read Scripture and understand what justice is, it's very practical. And there are a lot of folks, myself included at times, who think of it as such a practical thing. You just go out and you do it. There's steps to make justice happen. There's things that we do when we're dismantling racism or addressing anti-Islamic comments, whatever it is. And so we go out and we work for justice. And I think that's at best half right, because Scripture is just infused with this idea that God is a God of justice and that God is working for justice. And Paul and one of my favorite books in the Bible, Paul in Romans, he talks about how we are freed in Romans chapter 6 so that we can become slaves to justice. And there's this inner and outer, and you're a scientist, so I hope you'll like this, but it's like the two strands of a DNA double helix that work together that you can't separate. You can't separate out the fact that God cares as much that I would be free of whatever chains bind me as the chains that are out in my neighborhood and the things that we see in our cities and in our world. And yeah, so for me, that blending, it's about an inner change that leads to an outward action, but it's also the reverse too. It's about action that we have in the community and participating in this much bigger story than ourselves, which then changes us and can bring us freedom and inspiration and draw us closer to God at the same time. So for me, it's both and. It's not like linear, first spirit and then justice. It's both and all the above and everything in between.
So another quote of yours, Pastor Marty, talks about, so Jesus' story would be hard to understand if we didn't know that his death came about as state-sponsored, religiously motivated public execution. And I'm hoping you can expound on what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think that comment is in a section of the book where I tell a story about Dominique Green and David Atwood, two friends of mine, or Dave is, Dominique was not a friend of mine, where I tell the story of their ministry that is very particular to a place that you can't understand who Dominique or Dave are unless you understand the place where they do this ministry. And they both use these words that probably all Christians would affirm, which is we're supposed to love, we're supposed to forgive. And Dominique was a man on death row, and so his context completely shaped. You can't understand his ethic, his theology, or what he was trying to teach unless you know he was in prison. And Dave was an outsider who was ministering to those on death row, and his love for enemies regardless, you can't understand that unless you understand where Dave was actually doing that. Like, he's doing that with the worst folks in the state. Same with Jesus. That context matters. We can't just talk about Jesus having died. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't give meaning to his story. Yes, he died, but it matters that it was in that context. Jesus was a Jew who came preaching something that was incredibly dangerous to the Jewish leaders, and also then, because of that, to the wider context. And he didn't just die. He wasn't just killed. He was killed by a religious theology that said he had to die, and then that was backed up by state-sponsored execution. The culture he lived in was this devastatingly violent culture where executions happened every single day. And they only happened to a particular kind of person, though. And so if we want to understand who Jesus was, his message, and the whole theology around his death and resurrection, you have to understand the context. Like Dominique's ethic of helping all of his death row inmate neighbors, because he has neighbors on both sides of him across the hall, right? But helping them understand forgiveness and conversion. That story is beautiful because of where it happened. Same with Jesus. It's just no way to understand it outside of the very Jewish roots and story that he lived.
Yeah, and so in that sense, you know, the religious movement of Jesus' time, their theology, you know, there's some parallels today as far as what our church, capital C Church, does to our neighbors in a kind of violent way. You know, do you see parallels with that?
Yeah, I do. I think as you understand, I mean, we've got to understand Jesus' story. That's what it means to be a Christian, is you understand what it was and then how it applies. But if I don't understand what it was, I can't apply it appropriately. Yeah, it's today. I see that in some of the political rhetoric on both sides. the idea that we have to kill somebody in order to protect the many, very much at the very heart of what put Jesus on the cross. If you want to understand sin in the world, you have to understand the sins that put Jesus on the cross. And those same sins they're everywhere today. So in Texas, we execute more people than any other state and almost any other country in the world. And it's that same interplay. The same thing that put Jesus on the cross is we're gonna kill the one in order to save the many. We protect ourselves in that way. Definitely true as far as criminal justice goes, not just in executions, but in the way we punish and the way we view crime. Definitely true also in the national political rhetoric about nationalism, about anti-immigrant language, about how it is that we need to protect ourselves from somebody else who's going to hurt us, other countries, other armies. That was at play in the story of Jesus. The leaders, they wanted to keep the people safe, and so they did what they did. I think it's John 19:51. I'd have to look in the book. John 19:51 talks about Caiaphas. He uses that language. We have to kill the one in order to protect the nation, and it's everywhere. You just see that all over the place. Which again, that's the borrowing the eyes of God. You understand the story of Jesus, and really what the good news about Jesus is, and then we can see and understand our world much more clearly.
Because it seems like the moral decision, right? If we, get rid of this one person, we will have, saved all these other lives, and we can think of any number of situations where take out that one guy, and the day is saved. Certainly sounds like the moral thing to do.
Yeah, it sounds like the thing, and we've been steeped in that. Like we've been raised with that general story. It's everywhere, and a lot of it is framed around the idea of revenge. That my life won't be complete until I seek and get revenge. Sometimes we call that justice, and often what we mean by that is that somebody gets what we think they deserve. I don't think that's biblical justice, but yeah, it's a very moral thing. You're right about that, and I think that unless and until we choose something different, then that's the story that we're going to live out of. That's the kind of moral worldview that we're going to have. And so, yeah, without a clear understanding of Jesus and how he was in this wider stream of shalom and justice, I just don't think that we're going to get it right today either.
Mm-hmm. Our good friend Robert Martin, who's running tech for us behind the scenes, has live fact-checked that the verse you mentioned is John 11:50. So thank you, sir, for your help. So your book is very much rooted in the culture and place of Houston. As you mentioned, it gives us a wonderful glimpse into the blessings and the challenges of the city. What do you feel what lessons does Houston have for other cities?
Yeah, it's definitely not my goal to write just for Houston. I think in writing about one particular locale, that and making it as personal and making it as clear, as making it as unique as Houston is, that's going to help other people actually see their own context better, I hope. And not just divert attention away from, you're from Columbus. I've got ministry friends and friends all over the world. I think that in seeing one place well, and so Houston itself, it's a city, and cities aren't the future. Cities are the present. There's more people in the cities than anywhere, and cities are also the world is coming into the cities. Any city in the United States is an incredibly diverse place. So to understand Houston, for me, is to understand how interfaith, how multicultural, how many differences are in Houston. And I think if I can see that in Houston, I'm going to see that everywhere. I know it's true in Columbus. It's true in the big cities where the world is coming to us. That's definitely one takeaway I hope people would see, is that the diversity of the city itself. And then I would really hope that people would catch, and maybe this is one of the biggest hopes I would have, is that people would be able to step away from the anecdotal ministry stories and see that in Houston there's a mosaic of stories, a mosaic of individual stories, congregations, people, and when you add them all together, it's actually this really quite impressive mosaic, even a movement. And that's true in Houston. I also know that it's true in other places as well. Why that's so important to me, though, is because when we're part of something big, that big, it takes us out of the everyday getting up and working on the same practical problems, and it helps us to see that we're not alone, and it helps us to see that our one story is part of this bigger mosaic, and man, this movement's got it. Like we're in this together for one, but we're covering the bases. And I think that is true in a lot of cities. One area that gets a lot of press in is around human trafficking, where in most of the big cities in our country, it's actually the church who's leading the way to address human trafficking and modern day slavery in our cities. So if you hear one story, one great story of a ministry or a church who's doing something, that's inspirational. But if you understand that it's the church, the Big C Church in all of the cities that's addressing that, like, that's something else entirely. That's the kind of thing I think we want to tell the world, and that's the church's best foot forward, not just the individual, but this bigger story. So for me, those are two things I hope others get as they hear about my Houston, is how multicultural the world is that we live in and how beautiful that is, and then also how this mosaic, this bigger movement, it's a pretty special thing, and when the church moves into the neighborhood, it just gets exciting.
And I feel like that brings hope for a lot of these really deep issues, these very systemic issues that can lead to discouragement or throwing up of hands, because when we understand ourselves as part of this broader movement, as part of the church, capital C, that brings so much potential to work on all those levels. You know, yes, we're a local church working at a local level, but we're part of this broader story, this good news story, that then allows us to work together as siblings in Christ in different parts of the country and different parts of the world, on different levels of the system, but knowing that because we're all part of this body of Christ, we're chipping away at it together simultaneously. I think there's a lot of hope in that.
I do too. So a personal story about my church. My church has been in Houston for almost 50 years, and we have always been a small church with a huge heart and a massive vision for our city of what we want to do in the city and of what it means to be a peace church. But I know when I moved to Houston 8 years ago, when I came, and I think with some of the people in my church, I approached ministry in Houston thinking that we were the only peace church in town, which meant that we were very unique and that we had kind of an odd message. And then I thought a lot of the ministries that we offered the community, like we were alone. We were the ones doing this. Maybe this tiny little group over here that we kind of know of. That is not the story. It's not that Houston has 5, 10, 15, 20 Mennonite churches. That's not it at all. It's that Anabaptism in many forms, usually not even with the word Anabaptism tied to it, is alive and well in the city. There are people who are passionate about a lot of the same things that I am, and they're doing more than I ever could have dreamed, or they have ministries, programs up and running that I wasn't aware of. And so again, to see that mosaic, man, for me and my church, that's been a game changer. We are not the only peace church in town. We are not the only ones doing this. And to be in a room where you can see that makes a lot of difference. It then becomes about joining what's already happening, and you don't have this burden of needing to create something. I thought for a while that maybe I needed to create some sort of nonprofit in Houston and work on peace or something. I don't ever see that I'm going to do that, because they're all out there already. There's amazing people, programs, organizations that I want to help be a catalyst for and to bless and resource and tell their stories. I don't ever need to compete with them with another ministry, though, because it's all there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I might throw another quote at you that I've got here. It says, and this is quoting you saying, "My faith will suffer if I ignore that God wasn't merely with the Israelites in Egypt. He was also very much against Pharaoh." So I want to know, why is that important, and can God really be against anyone?
Yeah, so sometimes I try to be provocative there, but my reading of that story is a parallel to any sort of injustice that's happening today as well. I wouldn't have been able to say that. I mean, honestly, I could not have said that, probably even not when I moved here. 8 years ago, I would not have been able to say that. The difference for me has been hearing about life and people's experience who are marginalized. It's about connecting with the Black church in the Fifth Ward and hearing what it means to be part of a community in Houston that's been neglected for 100 years, and how generational poverty and racism has changed that community. It's been about hanging out with undocumented immigrants in Houston and realizing some of the struggles that they have. It's about learning the stories of my gay and lesbian friends and family and hearing the stories that they have, and all of those help me to realize, again, it goes back to that peacemaking thing. More often than not, we can't make peace unless we have named something clearly that we're saying no to. So again, in that quote referencing the story of the Exodus, where God rescues the oppressed and he brings them out, but he does it in a way that didn't fit my mental model. My mental model would have been that the Israelites convert the Pharaoh. Moses he grew up in the princess's house. Why didn't Moses ever go and try to convert her one at a time, like you do this slow cultural change? That didn't happen. God basically said no to one form of culture and freed them from that. Great story for today. I think that just gives a lot of meaning to what we see today in liberation theology, feminist theology, queer theology, Anabaptist theology. It's a healthy, I think, really important way to read history, that when you stand on the margins, which is where Jesus was at, so I'm not asking for anything radical, when you stand on the margins where Jesus was and where the Black church is today, where the Latino church is in America today, you see the world differently. And I think at that point you see that the gospel is both a no to something and a yes. And the yes is very beautiful and very practical, but there's a no. Like, there are things that we need to say no to. So we're not keeping the peace. Like, that can be pretty hard to do that. But yeah, there's stuff we got to say no to, and I think that's reflected in the Exodus story.
Yeah, and seems like one of the things that you talk about kind of saying no to is kind of our Western dominant culture, Americanized Christianity. Mm-hmm. In fact, at one point you say the disciple-making culture in Western Christianity is woefully inadequate for equipping us to put our faith into action. So speak a little bit to what you mean by that, and then, what does it take?
Yeah, the culture that we live in is filled with both great things and then things that are less so, right? So how do we interpret what is what? I don't think that American culture in a sort of general way is going to by itself form us to be the kind of people who pursue the common good. And certainly not the kind of people who pursue the common good as defined by Jesus, Shalom and Justice. And so for me, yeah, Western culture, I talk about capitalism and consumerism more, I guess, about how so often that is presented even as a type of small s salvation, that when you do the right things, you have the right stuff, you're in the right context, that your life will be better. And so it's not just about having too much stuff. Like, that can twist our souls and our understanding of ourselves, God, and our world. And yeah, so for me, I use the language of spiritual surgery, that it's time for us to separate ourselves out from Western culture and the kind of civil religions that it created. And Western culture and civil religions have had an influence on all of us, myself included. So it's not an easy job, but I think that formation practices in the church today, in kind of this post-Christian, post-Christendom world where a lot of people are spiritual but not religious, or don't see themselves as being antagonistic to the church, a lot of times for good reasons, that formation in this context has to be a lot more robust, a lot more personal, has to be a lot more about the gospel reading us and helping us see ourselves and helping us to see in our own lives, our own hearts and our own desires, how we need to separate out Western culture from God's desires, so that we don't just pray it, but we can live your will be done in places like Houston as it is in heaven. So formation, yeah, more robust, more personal, a lot more interior kinds of work. And I have tried this in the past for years and years, but I can't do it alone. I'm somewhat of an introvert. I've always liked my journal. I love prayer all by myself with my Bible on my lap. All that's good, but that's not going to get me where I need to go. I need to do this hard work in community with people that I trust and who are going to be honest to me, and also really gracious to me. Like, I don't want them to be honest without the grace, but to be in a community of grace and truth, I think is like really necessary for formation in this place at this time.
Yeah, some of what you're talking about really resonates with me as far as some of the lessons that I've learned here on the south side of Columbus. Our church is a multi-class church in that it's about 60% at or below the poverty line, and then the other 40% are middle and upper class. And it's such a fantastic context to learn and grow deeper into so many of the lessons that I think Jesus was trying to teach us. There's some irony in that our flagship ministry, the ministry that actually launched the church, is a free store, and so it's all about stuff. It gives away free clothing and household items most days of the week, and it's this interesting thing to watch, because what we've learned is that there is this divine economy of abundance, and if we give generously, it triggers a return to the abundance. So we worship a God of abundance, not a God of scarcity. We see in Genesis there's an abundance. We see in Revelation there's an abundance. And in the middle, human fear and greed can mess some of that up. But if we will be generous, it triggers that abundance. Well, what that means is we also have to hold loosely our stuff and our identity in our stuff. And so this ministry and the relationships that we've formed in the community actually can often be a ministry to the middle class and upper class folks, courtesy of our hard living folks, to say, a lot of the middle class consumerism pathologies that we have to be broken of those. And so I think that's part of what the folks that come and stay in our church, that our middle and upper class find so captivating, is to be broken of some of their own middle and upper class pathologies, and to see some of that gospel come to life right before them. That really, what we're learning is poverty is less about a lack of stuff and more about broken relationships. And that when those relationships are restored, we get a free flow of resources and, frankly, of theology that then restores all of us. So, not to go on about that, but it resonated what you're saying.
Yeah, you're definitely further along personally, and then as a church than I am on that. I love that story, and I long for that. I have glimpses of that, but I long to be free of this middle class thing, the rat race of needing to have a certain income so that I can stay in a house and put food on the table and do the things that are just what small families do. Like that can be hard work sometimes, and I know I'm not alone in that. So I really resonate with that it's not just, again, we talked about this earlier, it's not just morals, but there's a spirituality to this behavior. There's something really deep that happens, can be even transformative. But what I heard in that is this idea of your story of the free store. First thing that popped in my head is that biblical justice is really when people have enough. And so you're getting people enough. You're getting people what they need. And I probably don't need plates or clothes to be given to me, but somebody does, and that's justice work right there. Because you're helping people get enough. So I'm intrigued by that mostly because I'd like to experience some of that freedom that you're talking about too.
Yeah, it's a profound thing on Sunday morning to watch the widow put her mite in the offering basket, and to know that actually does become multiplied into the $50 million in housing work that we do. I mean, there's a direct connection between her being willing to offer that trust, and it's not just about what goes in the offering plate, but it's about folks that when they pray, give us this day our daily bread, actually mean that. Because when I pray that, I don't mean that. Because I go to work and I get a paycheck, and I provided me this day with my daily bread. Yeah. And if I'm honest with myself, that's really my lived theology. That's what I'm living into, that trust that I've provided that. But for someone to say, no, I really don't know where dinner is, but maybe has every right to be angry with God, but is not. And some of those lessons are profound. Yeah. And so to see that lived out each day is healing, and when folks come to volunteer and do good things, I think really the folks that stick it out for the long haul are there because they know they get just as much out of it, if not more, than what they're putting into it.
So that story, you just hinted at that, but does your widow who gives her mite on Sundays, is she aware that she's a part of this $50 million story of housing going up? Is that part of what she's doing?
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing because we talk about all these ministries that the church does and all these different categories, and it's the idea that we have this group ownership of what we're doing. So with the technical structure of it, technically the church owns the nonprofit, so Church for All People owns Community Development for All People. So technically it's the nonprofit that's doing the housing, but if you ask anyone on the block who sold that house, they'll say it's the church.
Yeah.
And so there is this interconnectedness, and people have a certain amount of healthy pride in what we're doing. So one of the values that we have is ministry with, not ministry at, to, or upon. Mm-hmm. And so someone, it happens every single day, someone shops in the free store and then turns around and volunteers, giving away the fresh produce that our fresh market has, or may shop for the fresh produce and then help with an exercise class or what have you. And so again, it's this idea that we're doing it together, ministry with, not at, to, or upon, and that's really core to what we do. I would say the two principles that are most guiding are the idea of relationships and ministry with, coupled with that idea of the divine economy of abundance.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful story, though. That's Shalom right there in the south side of Columbus. What you're doing on a neighborhood level is giving people dignity, giving people what they need, building homes, and then it sounds to me like the reputation of the church, like you're giving God a good name because you're not, you're not just seen as somebody who is wanting to proselytize to bring people into your church, but you actually really care about the common good. I think that your story is great. It's beautiful, but I think when the church pursues the common good for the benefit of our neighbors, that when we do that kind of work for our neighbors with them, I love how you said that, with, not at them. But that itself is part of the gospel message. I think that the world looks at that and they say, "Oh, wow, is that what the church is about?" Mm-hmm. If the church is about that, then I'm actually pretty interested. And I've seen that around here. Like there are similar stories of what you're telling about community development that happens in Houston, and same kind of things. People look at it, and some of them shake their heads, but they say, "Wow, that's what we actually need. We actually need what you're offering."
Mm-hmm. I think the church, capital C, has to understand what it does to our witness when we function in one of these ways or another. You know, are we the same answer that the rest of the world is giving, or do we have something different to offer? And if we're simply recapitulating what people are already hearing in the world around them, we're not really setting ourselves as distinctive. And so why bother with the church? I think I'd be hard pressed to answer that question for someone if we're not offering something different.
Yeah, that's a great contrast between what some churches would think of as ministry in the city or in a neighborhood. I have a friend in Houston who calls what he experiences in his neighborhood as mission bombs, where people will come in from churches from sometimes in the suburbs, from not in that neighborhood. They'll come in and they'll feed the people, they'll paint the fence, they'll be there for an afternoon, and they take the picture and they go home. So I love that idea of the mission bomb. You come, you give, you've changed things, and you leave. That's not at all what you're up to. And if you're listening and you like the idea of missional, if you're up to speed on what missional is with the people, long-term relationships in a particular neighborhood, and that idea of a service project, like that just doesn't work. It's got to be with the people and responding to the needs that they have put forth and not the things that we think they need. So, I like the language of missional for that reason, because it kind of cuts through that, the idea of the service project of the mission bomb.
Yeah, that's such a funny term, mission bomb. I love it because it is so true, and we see it in our community all the time. And I think part of why it doesn't work is it's all about what we have to offer them. And it's us and it's them, and we're coming in with the solutions and our programs to the solutions, when really the people always have to be the solutions. The people will always be our greatest assets. I see there's a question about how someone would start going about doing ministry with, and it's such an important question because it really does come down to relationships. The reason the free store was initially opened wasn't so much to get the stuff to people, but to build relationships. So the whole idea was, hey, middle and upper class folks, come and donate your things, but then follow your things, follow your donations, and see where it's going, and build relationships with those folks. Sit at table with folks. You may pray for folks in poverty, but are you asking them to pray for you as well? You might serve at the soup kitchen, but are you sitting down at table as well? So much of Jesus' ministry, when Jesus is building relationships, it's around food, it's around relationships, it's around that common dialogue. And so ministries that are ministry with will always be relationship-based. And one of the reasons why the free store works is because you can come and shop every day. The merchandise is going to change just by the nature of what it is. And so people come back every single day, and we're building relationships together. Any successful ministry, when you break it down, will be made up of assets, and we always believe people are our greatest assets. And so it doesn't really matter what the focus of the ministry is. If it's building relationships, then the rest will go from there, because then you have the opportunity to ask people, what are your hopes, dreams, and aspirations, and let's do that together. But it always starts with relationships.
Yeah, absolutely agree. So the title of the book, The Gospel Next Door, it hits on exactly what you said there, Katelin, that it's not us bringing something into this dark and impoverished neighborhood or person's life, but to be able to see that the gospel is already working out there in the community and in people's lives already, and it's our job to maybe name that or to join it. So this question of how would you suggest someone start doing ministry with? Yeah, it has to begin with relationships, because as good as we are, as much as we do have to offer, like, that's not what it's about. It's really about the relationship. And it happened to be this week. I sat down this week with a marvelous lady named Martha McCrease. She's the executive director at a local service organization, Christian service organization in Houston. And we were having this conversation, like, how do you get out into the community and actually meet the needs that are there? And like, you actually just have to listen to the people that are there. The first step of being with someone is coming in not with any sort of assumption, but figuring out what the community needs. So within the last year, her organization added an immigration services connection, and before that, it was mental health counseling for the unemployed, and before that, it was English as a second language class. But all of that was rooted in Martha's connection to the community and in the way that they listen to their clients. They are constantly gaining feedback. The other thing I would say to our great question there is, I've said this before, I don't think you need to start something. Find somebody who's already doing the ministry with, and either just be their partner and work with them, or at least learn from them pretty significantly. And if you really do feel the call to start something else, follow that call, but learn from somebody who's already doing the work in the neighborhood. If I was moving to Columbus and I wanted to start ministry with, I would go hang out with Katelin and spend a day at the free store and just figure out how they do this. How do they blend that the relationships so that you can't tell who the client is and who the provider is?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we have found just by our very nature that we joke about it in the office, this term, we're the catalytic collaborators, because of that value of joining in with the good things that folks around us are doing, partnering, and making good things happen together. Yeah, that's a strong value of ours in that sense. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I am mindful of the time. We're coming up to 1 hour. We've been talking about Pastor Marty's new book, The Gospel Next Door. Pastor Marty, do you have any closing words you want to say, or final things to add?
If you are interested in reading a chapter, there's a free chapter on Herald Press's website, which is my publisher, and it's a chapter that introduces the concept of the book, which is that through the gospel of Jesus, Shalom and Justice, we can see our world more clearly, and when we see our world more clearly, we can then live faithfully in this complex world. So you can read a free chapter on Herald Press's website, and I encourage you to do that. And I would say the thing that I'm learning from people who are reading this and giving me feedback, which, by the way, if you're reading this, I'd love your feedback, because I'm learning from people. And one of the things I keep hearing almost happened by accident, and that is a message of hope, a message that God really is at work, that God is doing bigger things than what I have been able to, and others have been able to see before. And yeah, in this really complex world where it seems like every day there's some new headline, there's times in the last couple of years where I've just had to turn off the news for like weeks at a time. It just gets really hard to live in this world sometimes, and that's not even the daily grind. So I've really appreciated that people have taken hope away from this. That was my intent, but I think it surprises me how much that's been the number one takeaway. So I would hope that people would walk away from this book with a deeper belief in the God who loves our world so deeply. He loves me, but he also loves my neighborhood, my entire city and nation and world, and that's surprising to me. So I would hope that people would have a stronger belief and a really deep hope that Christianity has something to offer this beautiful, complex world that we're in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pastor Marty. We've been talking with Pastor Marty Troyer, the author of The Gospel Next Door, pastor at Houston Mennonite Church, and the Chronicles Peace Pastor. Appreciate you spending the time with us with this MennoNerds conversation tonight.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.